I find myself compelled to address something that transcends ordinary political dysfunction and ventures into territory that should alarm anyone who understands how democratic institutions collapse. What we are witnessing in Washington is not merely another partisan battle or constitutional disagreement. It is the systematic dismantling of the separation of powers doctrine that has anchored American governance for 2.5 centuries. The current administration has crossed a threshold that transforms political conflict into existential crisis, and I fear that most observers are catastrophically underestimating what is now unfolding before our eyes. The Supreme Court's recent hearings on tariff authority reveal the depth of constitutional erosion we face. When 9 justices, spanning the ideological spectrum from Roberts to Sotomayor, express unified skepticism about executive power grabs, we are not observing routine judicial oversight. We are watching the final institutional safeguard recognize that constitutional boundaries have been obliterated. Chief Justice Roberts' pointed observation that the relevant statutes contain no mention of tariffs whatsoever cuts to the heart of a much larger pathology, an executive branch that has abandoned any pretense of operating within legal constraints. Justice Gorsuch's inquiry about whether Congress can simply hand all its powers to the President and then become unable to reclaim them represents perhaps the most crucial constitutional question of our era. The tariff regime itself serves as a microcosm of authoritarian methodology. The administration has imposed an 18% average duty on imports without legislative authorization, constitutional justification, or economic rationale. This represents a $430 billion annual tax increase implemented through emergency declarations and dubious statutory interpretations. The economic consequences, inflation running at 3.4% instead of the 2.2% it would achieve without these duties, demonstrate how constitutional violations translate directly into material suffering for ordinary Americans. Yet the deeper significance lies not in the economic damage, but in the precedent. If a president can unilaterally restructure the entire trade policy of the world's largest economy, what constraints on executive power remain meaningful? The government shutdown crisis exposes another dimension of institutional breakdown. For 43 days, the federal government ceased functioning not because of external emergency or genuine policy impasse, but because of deliberate political theater. Air traffic controllers worked without pay, while the administration simultaneously waged economic war against trading partners. Food assistance for 40 million Americans was disrupted, while the president claimed unprecedented authority to reshape international commerce. This juxtaposition is not coincidental. It reflects a governing philosophy that views institutional chaos as politically advantageous and constitutional constraints as obstacles to overcome rather than principles to respect. I observe with growing alarm how the electoral defeats of November 2025 have accelerated rather than moderated these authoritarian tendencies. Virginia and New Jersey delivered devastating verdicts against Republican governance, with swings of 9 to 10 points compared to 2024 results. Trump's response was not introspection or course correction, but deeper entrenchment in anti-democratic rhetoric and expanded executive overreach. When Virginia voters chose Democratic candidates by 15-point margins, specifically citing economic pain from tariff policies, the administration's answer was to claim the elections were somehow illegitimate or irrelevant. This represents a fundamental rejection of democratic accountability, the notion that electoral defeat should influence policy direction. The Supreme Court's willingness to hear constitutional challenges to tariff authority signals institutional recognition that we have entered uncharted territory. Legal scholars across the political spectrum acknowledge that current executive claims have no basis in constitutional text, historical practice, or judicial precedent. The administration's argument essentially holds that Congress has permanently surrendered its taxation authority to the presidency through vague statutory language written for entirely different purposes. If this logic were accepted, the constitutional structure would be fundamentally altered without amendment, legislation, or democratic consent. The separation of powers would become meaningless if any president could claim indefinite emergency authority over any policy domain. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is its intersection with broader democratic erosion. The administration's approval ratings have collapsed. Trump's economic approval sits at 17.6%, while his inflation management scores 27.5%. Yet these political failures have not produced policy moderation. Instead, we see escalating attacks on democratic norms, from surveillance of protest movements to threats against judicial independence. When Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene publicly criticizes the administration's economic messaging as gaslighting, we understand that even hardcore supporters recognize the disconnect between official rhetoric and lived reality. This creates a feedback loop where political isolation breeds more extreme behavior rather than strategic recalibration. The fiscal implications compound the constitutional crisis in ways that threaten American global leadership. With debt approaching $38 trillion and interest payments exceeding $1 trillion annually, the United States faces unprecedented constraints on its policy options. The administration's response has been to claim ever broader emergency powers rather than acknowledge fiscal reality or pursue sustainable governance. When tariff revenues of $195 billion are promised to fund $520 billion in direct payments to citizens, we see magical thinking replace rational policy formulation. This fiscal innumeracy is not merely incompetent. It represents a deliberate strategy to justify expanded executive authority through manufactured crises. I realize that many observers still cling to normalcy bias, believing that American institutions will somehow contain this crisis through traditional checks and balances. This comfort is misplaced. We are witnessing the systematic capture of regulatory agencies, the weaponization of emergency powers, and the rejection of judicial oversight. The Federal Reserve's independence faces direct challenges as the administration demands monetary policy subordination to political objectives. When central bank credibility erodes, and we see early signs in dollar volatility and inflation expectations, the economic consequences cascade globally because the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. The international dimension of this crisis deserves urgent attention because American constitutional breakdown affects global stability directly. NATO allies watch with alarm as the United States abandons predictable governance in favor of erratic executive rule. Trade relationships built over decades dissolve under arbitrary tariff policies implemented without consultation or strategic coherence. When the world's largest economy operates through emergency declarations rather than legal frameworks, international cooperation becomes impossible to maintain. China and Russia explicitly benefit from American institutional chaos because it validates their authoritarian models while undermining democratic legitimacy worldwide. The pathway from constitutional crisis to systematic collapse follows predictable patterns observable across historical precedents. Democratic institutions prove surprisingly fragile when faced with determined authoritarianism, especially when that authoritarianism emerges from within the system itself. The gradual erosion of norms, the capture of enforcement mechanisms, the weaponization of legal processes, these dynamics accelerate once they begin, because each violation makes subsequent violations easier to justify. We are now at a stage where ordinary political competition has been replaced by existential struggle over the fundamental structure of American governance. Consider the implications if the Supreme Court upholds executive authority to impose unlimited tariffs without congressional authorization. This would establish precedent for presidential control over taxation, historically considered the core legislative prerogative. From there, emergency declarations could justify executive control over spending, regulation, and even civil liberties. The constitutional separation of powers would exist only on paper, while actual governance operates through presidential decree. This transformation could occur legally through judicial acquiescence rather than military coup, making resistance far more difficult to organize and justify. The economic consequences of constitutional collapse would cascade globally through multiple channels. American debt markets would face unprecedented volatility as investors question the stability and predictability of the legal framework governing their investments. The dollar's reserve currency status depends fundamentally on confidence in American institutions and rule of law. If that confidence erodes, capital flight could trigger currency crisis, inflation crisis, and global recession simultaneously. Emerging markets holding dollar-denominated debt would face impossible refinancing conditions, while developed economies would struggle to manage monetary policy without stable dollar anchors. I find myself confronting three potential scenarios, each more disturbing than conventional political analysis acknowledges. The first involves successful institutional resistance, where the Supreme Court strikes down executive overreach and congressional Republicans abandon Trump's authoritarian project in favor of constitutional governance. This requires political courage we have not yet observed and judicial independence that faces mounting pressure. The second scenario features gradual democratic erosion, where executive authority expands incrementally through emergency declarations, judicial capture, and bureaucratic subordination until constitutional constraints become meaningless. The third involves acute crisis, economic collapse, international conflict, or domestic upheaval that provides justification for openly authoritarian governance. Each scenario demands immediate citizen action because democratic institutions cannot defend themselves. The separation of powers requires active enforcement by legislators willing to defend their constitutional prerogatives against executive encroachment. Judicial independence depends on political support for court decisions that constrain executive power. Democratic accountability relies on informed citizens who understand the stakes and demand constitutional governance from their representatives. The current crisis tests whether Americans still possess the civic knowledge and political will to maintain democratic institutions under pressure. The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated. Constitutional crises accelerate rapidly once they pass critical thresholds because each institutional failure makes subsequent failures more likely and more severe. The Supreme Court hearings on tariff authority represent perhaps the last clear opportunity for institutional resistance to executive authoritarianism. If the court acquiesces to unlimited presidential taxation power, the precedent will justify executive control over virtually any policy domain through creative interpretation of emergency statutes. Congressional abdication of its constitutional responsibilities becomes irreversible once the judiciary sanctions that abdication. The Federal Reserve's predicament illuminates another dimension of institutional capture that threatens global financial stability. Jerome Powell's position becomes untenable as the administration demands monetary policy subordination while simultaneously implementing inflationary tariff regimes. When the Fed chair's term expires in May, the replacement choice will signal whether the United States maintains central bank independence, a cornerstone of modern economic governance, or subordinates monetary policy to political expedience. The global consequences of Fed politicization would be catastrophic because central bank credibility underpins international confidence in dollar assets and American financial leadership. The military's constitutional oath creates additional tensions that remain largely unexamined in public discourse. Defense officials face unprecedented pressure to support domestic enforcement operations that blur the lines between civilian and military authority. The administration's expansion of emergency declarations to justify tariff impositions represents a militarization of economic policy that could normalize presidential claims of war powers during peacetime, when constitutional scholars warn about the erosion of civilian control over the military. They reference precisely these dynamics where emergency authority expands beyond any recognizable constitutional framework. State-level resistance provides some hope, but also reveals the fragmentation threatening national unity. When state governments openly defy federal tariff policies or refuse cooperation with immigration enforcement, we observe federalism under extreme stress. The administration's response, threatening to withhold federal funding, deploying federal agents against state officials, escalates constitutional conflict toward potential confrontation between different levels of government. This dynamic historically presages civil conflict when federal and state authorities claim competing sources of legitimacy and refuse mutual recognition. The private sector's response demonstrates how economic actors adapt to authoritarian governance in ways that institutionalize corruption. Corporate leaders privately acknowledge the arbitrariness and destructiveness of current policies while publicly expressing support to avoid regulatory retaliation. This dynamic, observable in authoritarian transitions worldwide, gradually transforms market economy into crony capitalism, where business success depends on political loyalty rather than economic performance. The long-term consequences include reduced innovation, misallocated capital, and economic stagnation disguised by artificial policy interventions. International allies face impossible choices that reshape global governance structures regardless of American domestic outcomes. European leaders must decide whether to maintain institutional relationships with the United States despite its unreliability, or accelerate development of alternative frameworks for international cooperation. China benefits strategically from American institutional chaos, while Russia exploits Western disunity to advance territorial ambitions. The NATO alliance confronts questions about collective security guarantees when the leading member operates through unpredictable emergency declarations rather than stable policy frameworks. The timing of this crisis coincides with multiple global stress points that amplify both domestic and international consequences. Climate change accelerates refugee flows, while resource scarcity increases international tensions. Technological disruption destabilizes employment patterns, while artificial intelligence raises questions about economic distribution and social control. Demographic transitions strain social security systems, while geographic inequality fuels political polarization. These underlying pressures interact with constitutional crisis to create compound instability that exceeds any single government's capacity to manage through traditional policy tools. The media's role in normalizing authoritarian behavior deserves critical attention because information systems shape public understanding of democratic norms. When major news organizations treat unprecedented executive power grabs as ordinary political developments, they contribute to the erosion of democratic consciousness that enables further authoritarian advance. The administration's attacks on press freedom combine with algorithmic manipulation to create epistemic chaos, where citizens cannot distinguish legitimate governance from authoritarian overreach. The international legal implications of American constitutional breakdown affect global governance systems in ways that will persist for generations. When the world's dominant power abandons rule of law in favor of arbitrary executive authority, it delegitimizes international institutions that depend on American leadership and credibility. Treaty obligations become meaningless when executive interpretation changes unpredictably. Trade relationships dissolve when legal commitments carry no binding force. Security alliances weaken when partner nations cannot rely on stable American policy frameworks. I conclude with a stark assessment that I hope proves pessimistic, but fear represents realistic analysis. American democracy faces its most serious challenge since the Civil War, not from external enemies, but from internal constitutional breakdown. The current administration has crossed lines that previous presidents respected regardless of party affiliation. The response from other institutions has been inadequate to the scale of the threat. Citizens who value democratic governance must understand that their immediate action, contacting representatives, demanding constitutional compliance, supporting judicial independence, may determine whether American democracy survives this crisis or transforms into something entirely different. The next few months will reveal whether the American experiment in self-governance can withstand determined assault from within its own institutions.